Hello, this is G. Michael Vasey, and you're listening to the podcast, The Magical World of G. Michael Vasey. Well, I got up at 4:30 a.m. this morning to speak with Alan Greenfield over in the US. Alan, of course, is the author of the Complete Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts, which is selling quite rapidly now after the successful series Hellier, in which the book had a central role. And I enjoyed a tremendous conversation with Alan that went on for over 2 hours, and I've edited down, where we covered everything from magic and getting started in magic, OTO activities, Ufonauts and Ciphers, using the cipher, about Terry R Wriste, and then finished off by talking about synchronicities in and around Hellier. It's a fascinating show, and I'd like to welcome Alan Greenfield.
That's a hard question to answer because it's like when people ask me about my interest in UFOs. I don't know where it started. I think it was something that I always had. I remember that when I was a small child, and I mean small, I mean preschool, my father was talking about the 1952 Washington, D.C. sightings that put a lot of things in motion. I perked up and remember that moment where he was talking about, they saw flying saucers over restricted airspace in D.C. Now, why would I even remember that? I don't remember what I did on the beach or whatever. We went to Miami every year, so there was nothing special. But that immediately grabbed me, But the more civilized answer, I guess, because who knows, maybe in a previous life I was a magician, is that all of my interests that have been a part of my life for, I don't even like to think how many years, 60 years, something like that. In 1960, when I was about 12 or 13, pubescent, and I think that's, if you want to look into the psychological things, look there, a series of synchronicities occurred in my life. And all of these interests sort of came together, although I have since then fought the good fight. Only lately do I think that it's beginning to hit home with a lot of people that all of these subjects, magic, occultism, cryptids, flying saucers or UFOs or whatever you want to call them, ghosts, spirits, they're all part of the same whole. And that is based in something approximating the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. That is, portals open and things come through. And how we define those things and how we look at those things are very subjective because we're not hardwired, as I often say, for that sort of thing. In terms of biological time, one of my favorite expressions is we just dropped out of the trees 10 minutes ago. And in terms of geological time, it was a few seconds ago. And in terms of cosmological time, nothing, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second. That's where we evolved from. So the notion that we have in our sensory world the ability to cognitively resolve whatever these what's-its are, as they actually are, even if that applies, is very, very limited. So we see what we can understand. And I think that applies to magic and to all of these other areas as well. What happened in 1960 was I had what I took to be then a UFO sighting. Right after I had read something about the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, which I was a member of for 10 years. We all do stupid things when we're young. They asked me to join, so I joined their organization and was off on the nuts and bolts trip for about 6 or 8 years until I figured out that was not really what was going on and that government conspiracies were really a waste of energy because any ufologist knew as much about UFOs as the 5 people that were employed by Project Blue Book, Grudge, Sign, whatever they called it at any given time. At the same time, I got a note from University Books, which said that they were starting something called a Mystic Arts Book Society, which meant they were going to issue these hardcover books at a discounted rate of anything that wasn't nailed down by copyright. And so I started to read really sophisticated stuff, what was available then, not locally available, God knows. We had a store that had a couple of books on astrology, and that was it, because I'm in the deep south of America, and we didn't cotton that sort of thing, if you know what I mean. One of the first that I read was Waite's book on the funny, I can't say Waite's name without thinking of Crowley's put down of his name, the Dead Weight. They had some divergence of opinion, but he was a turgid writer, but he was also very thorough. And I read several books by him, including his book on the tarot, which there were no decks available in the United States at that time, except obscurely the one from the Church of Light, a descendant of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light. The only deck that was available was from University Books, which was the Pamela Coleman Smith Waite deck, Rider Pack, all those names apply. I started reading that. My first reading was for my mother in 1962, and I've been doing readings ever since. So I may be, outside of the Roma community, I may be the longest serving tarot reader in the United States of America.
Cool. Anyway, it seems like you ended up in the sort of Crowley side of things. Is that correct?
Not at that point. It was more like 7, 8 years later, I started to read Uncle Izzy's books, Israel Regardie's book. And the first one I read was one that Crowley had actually written that Regardie edited under the name Oliver Haddo, and it had a psychedelic cover, and it was called The Herb Dangerous or something. And, that was of some interest, but I'm not a druggie at all, and I wasn't then. So it was interesting, and I was more interested in Regardie's introduction than I was in the book. But then I read The Eye in the Triangle, including the introductions by Bob Wilson, who later became a friend, and not a friend of Crowley, a friend of mine. Well, he would have been a friend of Crowley for about 2 minutes like everybody else, but wrong period. And there was also, I think, a foreword by Regardie, I think. I read it. It was somewhat critical, far more critical than the more recent worshipful books on Crowley. And I started to get interested in Crowleyan magic at a time when the one bookstore in the United States that had magical stuff that you could order, including some things like medieval manuscripts and complete original sets of the first volume of the Equinox. Read the Blue Equinox, but I wasn't a joiner. The only organization I'd ever been a member of at that point was the Boy Scouts of America, which is an initiatory society. Baden-Powell was a Freemason, and he modeled it on Masonry for boys, so to speak. So I was not, as a young man now, we're talking early 20s, I'd done a lot of traveling. I'd been pretty much all over the Western world, but I had no taste for initiation rituals or blood rites or any of that sort of thing. Fast forward another several years, and my wife at the time took an interest in Kenneth Grant's version of the OTO.
Yeah.
And I wrote a letter to the, you never know what these highfalutin names mean, but the local head of the Grant organization, which at that time, there were no restrictions on it, no court rulings, one might say, phony court rulings, in my opinion. I mean, how does a court of law decide on what's essentially a spiritual issue? The answer is they can't and shouldn't and should have disallowed the case in the first place. But that's a whole program in and of itself. But they knew what they were doing, and they floated a few letters that gave them a certain level of legitimacy, although really, I've read them all. There's nothing in it that says, you're the next kahuna, so be the next kahuna. It just doesn't say that. And in fact, there are letters that more or less contradict that. So, but, that doesn't really matter, except maybe in an egregoric fashion. Anyway, I was very reluctant to join, and I wrote a letter to this anonymous person, Frater Nahash. Nahash wrote me back that he wanted my wife and I to keep a sexual diary and turn it over to him. And I looked at my wife, she looked at me, and that was our experience with the Grant Group. Anyway, she joined the other OTO, the corporate OTO, some years later. And at some point, word came through her that the local camp master, Bill Paget, also known as Frater Escolare Visionem. I just think these things are
ridiculous. Yeah.
Absolutely ridiculous and distract from the work itself.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, notice I always use the name Alan Greenfield, which is the name I was given by my parents. I have an Episcopal name that was given to me by Michael Berdio, and I use it on certain kinds of documents, but that's only because it was a gift from a man that I very much respect. So, that's not something of my own doing or choosing or whatever. She told me that the guy wanted to meet with me, and I thought, I don't know what this is about, but we'll meet in a public place and I'll see. So we went to the Little 5 Points pub, a place where anarchists met in the back room. How I would know that is a different story for a different program, a different type of program. And he wanted me to organize their church group, the EGC, and another Latinism. I said, I'm not a churchy person, I am a Jewish person. But I'm perfectly willing to work with, the symbolism there, as long as you understand that your motivation and mine may be very different. Mm-hmm. And I want that to be, clearly understood to be the case. And he was fine with that. So for about 5-6 years, as it moved up to an oasis and then a lodge, I worked with it. And my wife at the time had taken the primary initiation, the Minerval, and nothing else, but she continued to be active in what became Euless Lodge number 10, OTO Incorporated of California. And all that time I was working on the Gnostic Mass, but not initiated into anything. Then I get a letter from Grady had passed on, and in the infinite wisdom of the Council of Battlefield Ninth Degrees, which I've listened to the tape of, it's really a weird thing. At one point, I hear the voice of, I think, Jim Wasserman saying, well, we need to turn off the tape now. And when they turned it back on, William Gary Keith Breeze had become the Grand Kahuna, Poobah, whatever phrase you want to use, of the corporate OTO. And apparently his pitch was because the Ninths, I guess, didn't trust one another or something, because everybody expected Bill Heydrich to become the next Kahuna, because he had been involved, from day 3, I guess, with McMurtry. But that's when they turned off the recorder to discuss Heydrich. So maybe he said, I'm not interested, or maybe something was said, I don't know. But when it came back on, it was Breeze. And Breeze said he would operate it as a corporate entity. And he was true to his word. And I stayed with it for 20 years. I got a letter from Breeze saying he recognized me as a bishop of the EGC within the OTO. And I thought, I'm not even a member of the OTO. Mm-hmm. Maybe I should go ahead and take the Minerval initiation. And I did. But I spent a lot of time inside the cult and rose through the ranks to become a Sovereign Grand Inspector General. So they had me going all over the country and inspecting various local lodges. What I found convinced me that this organization didn't know its elbow from its arse, if you pardon my French. It's actually Anglo-Saxon, but we'll settle for French. And,
so there you are in the OTO for quite some time. And
20 years.
How did the Ufonauts book and the Cipher sort of fall out the back of that?
It didn't. In fact, this is what happened with that. There was another local organization that had good, friendly relations, at least with the local branch of the OTO, because it wasn't conflicting, and there was some overlap of membership, called the QBLH, which was for a long, long time until he passed on, headed by William W. Webb, WWW, at a time when the World Wide Web was coming into being. Webb had become entranced with the little group in Britain that had found the cipher in the grid page in Liberal, and they were very excited about it as a way of understanding Thelema, quote unquote, in a new way. And right. They had no following on this side of the pond until Webb began to recruit people. And one of the people he recruited was Tim Coote. And Tim Coote was a radical genius. He eventually committed suicide, I think, because he was too good for this world. The world just caved in on him. It's a tragic story. I knew him well. He was from upstate New York, and he had formulated a system of easily using computer technology. At the time, it was on a mainframe, probably by night without the knowledge of the company that owned it, coming up with what was called the Lexicon program. And while there are programs now that you can download from the internet or just use on the internet that use the cipher, then known as Cipher 6 for reasons too technical to go into, Coote came to me and said, this is a wonderful way to use the cipher that Jim Lee's cracked. You can use it for all kinds of occult words and phrases and against the text of Liberal and come up with all sorts of things. Well, I don't know why, but it didn't particularly interest me at that moment. But I did try it, and I said, yeah, that's very interesting. It was just adding to my burden, because at this point, my whole thing was to, move up in the real OTO. Right. I was thinking that middle period. So at some point, my other hat, my ufology hat, twitched on my head, and I thought, well, there are all these strange words and names that show up in contactee and other lore that really, strictly speaking, have nothing to do with the occult, unless you dig very deep, but that might be amenable to the cipher if it's really a valid cipher. And it was. The first thing I applied it to was the George Adamski's Orthon, which has the same value as Jesus. Well, what did Orthon look like? George Adamski's view of the world, my friend Jim Mosley told me, was very anti-Semitic. And the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus of mythology was exactly the way Orthon was described. Mm-hmm. And once I followed that up, okay, so Adamski dies, and then a few days later, I believe in Wiltshire in England, this guy claims that a being got out of a flying saucer. He said his name was Yamski, which is close enough. And I thought, well, this is occult. This is the same as occult stuff. So I started rapidly running through everything that I could find I had at this point been 30 years in ufology, so I pretty well had that down pat. And I happened to know the publisher of Illuminet Press, because before that it had been the Illuminet BBS back in the early days of internet stuff, and I had been on that group. So I presented him with a manuscript. I had been writing since the early 1960s, but I'd never had a book published, unless you count a self-published book called Saucers and Sorcerers that I got out when I was very young, and which is pretty much impossible to find now by my writing standards of any time in the last 20 years was not very good. I went down to my hometown and wrote the typescript of both Secret Cipher, the Ufonauts, and the sequel, which were meant to be part of one unit called Secret Rituals of the Men in Black. I wrote them together, and Illuminate Press gave me a very decent contract on Secret Cipher, the Ufonauts, which sold very well in the mid-1990s. It was my first book. Entitled me to no longer be just a writer, but an author. not at the level of Stephen King, but still an author. And it sold, are you ready, 1,000 copies. So I was getting ready to do the second one. Then I went to visit Bill Breeze, who was then living in North Carolina, right across the border from Georgia, and he jumped down my throat for writing a quote UFO book. He said, that's really not right. And I just sort of, the guy in person is not very regal, not what you would expect from a grand poobah of his little organization. But I was a member of that organization, and I think I was a fifth degree at that point, which is higher than most people ever go. I didn't want to, alienate him. But at the same time, the book was already in print, and I really, really enjoyed that. It was really good for me, and I expected it to make some progress. In fact, at the National UFO Conference the following year, I said, don't be surprised if this cipher changes, because historically, there's always a code to decode a lot of these things. Why there is a matter of some speculation. But I suspect that as my book gets used, and that was my intention, that people would grasp what it was all about and apply it to whatever area of the esoteric they were in, use lexicon, which was then available in a DOS-based format, which Tim Coote had made available to people, although he worried about the government using it for nefarious purposes, which was an interesting insight. I was set on getting the second book published. Well, Illuminate bought it, paid me a generous advance, and then I went up to see Mr. Breeze again. And I persuaded him to come back to Atlanta with me. By that time, I was a past master of the lodge. I was the second master of Euless Lodge. But I persuaded Bill to come back to Atlanta with me and perform a high-level initiation, which I was then not chartered to do. I was later. And amazingly, he said, okay, I'll come down with you. And so we drove down past the mystical Tallulah Gorge, the home of the Yumwee Chumdee, as the Cherokees knew it, the little people. And as we rode past it in the dark, listening to psychic TV with Bill jamming with them on his on a demo tape that he was playing, he tells me, well, the occult is much more respectable. Immediately, the rest of the sentence wouldn't have mattered, than flying saucers. So you really, really shouldn't be publishing that UFO book. And I said, well, there's a sequel. And he winced. And I thought, what is with this guy? Neither subject is particularly respectable, but that's not, respectability is not my goal. Finding truth is what I thought that the work is all about. And this seems to be a valuable tool for doing that. And what the hell is this man saying while he's playing his jamming session with Psychic TV, which if you knew the band, you would know is fairly outre itself. In fact, extremely outre. And it would have been amusing were it not for the fact that he added on when we got to Atlanta. We drove up into the driveway of the QBLH house, which is where I was living at the time. And he proceeded to tell me, well, you really need to stop with the UFO stuff because you lost a Grand Lodge office with this. Well, I was still into the OTO up to that moment anyway. It was about 10 years in. And the way cults operate, I think, and why people stay in them, there's a thing running on HBO right now called The Vow, similar cult in many ways, more similar to Scientology, but they all have a lot in common. And one of the things they have in common is if you've invested a lot of time, even if you begin to see through what you thought it was not, you've invested all this time, so maybe you invest some more time. And it took a couple of additional things, like the U.S. Grandmaster, a friend of mine at the time, telling me, oh, you can't be that because Jim Wasserman would never approve. And Wasserman is kind of this wild card. I don't think I'm breaking any rules by saying that he's a very right-wing person and he's an honorary trumpeter. But he doesn't hold, to my knowledge, any special office. He's just the guy that was instrumental in the court case, which legitimated, quote unquote, that particular version of the OTO. Anyway, when Dave Scriven told me that I had been turned down for an office because Jim Wasserman might not like it, to me, I was still in for another 7 years, but I wasn't in anymore. I was just seeing if I could get, as high a rank as I could before I stepped down and told it like it was. Then came the time when I realized I wasn't going any higher because I had offended the power that be. At that point, 10 years after I had refrained, I didn't even tell you, I bought the book back from the publisher and the second book and sat on it for 10 years because I was invested in the OTO.
Right.
So in a sense, Breeze censored me. I mean, only in that sense. He didn't. I did ask him, formally. I drew back and I said, are you telling me as the Grand Commander of the Order, whatever the bleep that means, not to publish a book? And he backed up on that one. He would back up if you pushed real hard. He said, no, I'm not telling you that, but you clearly can't go further in this organization if you're going to write UFO books. So at that point, I didn't give a damn. So I published the second book, or rather, it was published by Menudas Press. And I soon after that resigned from the various offices that I had in the OTO. I had intended to talk to Scriven and tell him why I was in the process of leaving the organization in an orderly fashion. And it just didn't happen for reasons that probably have more to do with fate than anything else. So I published my famous statement on the OTO, which basically at that time was reformist, not revolutionary. It was just saying they really need different leadership because they have failed to initiate in the upper degrees. It happened at the same time that because I had stepped down 6 months or so earlier from my various positions, I got all these certificates signed by the U.S. Grand Master thanking me for the wonderful services that I had performed in the OTO prison ministry, in the various functions that I had. I think I was secretary for correspondence for Grand Lodge, blah, 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 blah. And then that was after I had published the statement, so I figured I thought they would throw me out over this. So there were some local initiations that nobody else at that time in the Southeast was chartered to perform. So I called David Scriven and I said, do you want me to perform these? And he said, oh, yeah, go ahead and perform them. About a month later, called him again because I had a higher level initiation to perform. As it turns out, the last one that I performed. And he said, yeah, go ahead and do that. All of a sudden, they wanted to suspend me or expel me or something as part of a general purge. I later found out Gerald Del Campo was suspended and he quit. John Crow, who ran the Lima Coast to Coast podcast, he was suspended, and he was of a slightly lesser degree, and they unceremoniously expelled him. They took a year with me, and then they were having a grand tribunal on me. I knew the score because I used to sit on that council.
The question, I got a couple of other questions. I mean, why would the OTO be so threatened by your work in ufology? I mean, I don't get it.
Neither do I. And the interesting thing is that although it sold well in all editions, it was only well after the OTO and I had parted ways that one of my current publishers, I have two, came to me with an offer to combine the two books and call it the Complete Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts, which was my original plan anyway. So I said, the book is 20 years old. At least let us put a new introduction in it or something. And we published that. And then the Hellier series came out. And all of a sudden, I was a celeb. Overture, curtain lights, I'm a somebody. Woohoo! At 7.
Well, the thing about the book is I bought it too after Hellier, and I read it, and
you and thousands of other people. I mean,
yeah, and I
thought,
to be honest, the first
not only have people bought it, but they're doing what I originally wanted them to do, but never did that I know of, which is work with the cipher.
Yeah, I've played with the cipher as well, and I used it on some, let's just say that about 10, 15 years ago, I developed an inner contact, and got a lot of strange things came through, which I'd recorded in my diary. So I started using it to see if any of those things resonated. And of course, I discovered a lot of value, but I also thought to myself, well, but if I apply Kabbalah, just use the sort of Hebrew letter number concept, I also get some interesting things from it. So that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. What do you think is the difference between just the traditional letter number sort of Hebrew way of looking at things that people have done in the occult, like Paul Foster Case? He was big on that approach. That's the man I was thinking of, Paul Foster Case.
Well,
what is the difference between taking that approach and taking this Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts approach?
Okay. First of all, where it is applied in Secret Cipher, I applied it primarily at that point in my development of it to UFO-related names. By UFO-related, I mean, for example, the Mark Probert channeling experiences in the 1940s and 50s. He had a whole set of hidden masters or secret chiefs, or, I think in BSRA, which has been around since the mid-1940s, longer than I've been around, they had this whole pantheon, if I may call it such, of hidden masters. So I applied it to their names. The most humorous one, I thought, was Maharaja Nacha. The name itself is funny, and I began to use the term the funny names. I have some reservations about using that because it doesn't mean trivial. It means it's some kind of signal to mock you in a way. But anyway, the value of that is Maharaja Nacha. The value is fingers and toes, and that is in the book. And then by the time the second book was published, I had this long note that was aimed at Bill Breeze. I mean, it doesn't ever use his name, but it basically makes the argument that the subject matter of the book is at least as respectable as anything in the occult world, and maybe more respectable. Not that respect is what I'm looking for, but it is somewhere in his universe that's important. The difference between numerology, which I think is what you're talking about, and Kabbalah is the various techniques that go back to ancient times in Hebrew Kabbalah were applied later to Greek Kabbalah, and the same rules apply to English Kabbalah.
Correct.
With this difference.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yep.
There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There are 26 letters in the standard English alphabet. If you're going to do English and attempt to use the same values as in traditional Kabbalah, you're probably going to not get a great deal of useful information. There are going to be hits in any system. I'm always mindful of the fact that there are an infinite number of numbers and a finite but very, 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 very large number of combinations of letters. If you keep getting a good signal to noise ratio, and there's a certain amount of art involved in it, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, you get very meaningful answers to mysteries that have been debated since the dawn of time, because the Kabbalistic rules, which by trial and error go at least back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, because I've applied it to the Dead Sea Scrolls. My Hebrew is pretty good. And I thought, well, this is as old as we get in terms of biblical stuff or extra biblical stuff. I'm going to apply it to a couple of the funny words and names that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it works perfectly well. I've also seen it applied to other things. But again, if you go too far afield, it starts to be the infinite number of monkeys paradox, which Bob Newhart once said he was monitoring a project where they had an infinite number of monkeys with an infinite number of typewriters, and they were typing the great books. And they were monitoring to see if, that they actually at random typed the great books. One of the monitors said, look, I think this is something to be or not to be. That is the Gazornenplatte.
Let me ask you a little controversial question, which is, if you watch Hellier all the way through, there seems to be, at least I understood, there seems to be an implication suggested that you're partially behind the original emails in order to sort of promote your work. That's what I picked up anyway. And then when they finally have you on camera, it's the unasked question, I think.
No, they actually asked it. They asked me everything. Are you Terry Wriste? And I thought,
yes.
No, I'm not Terry Wriste. And in fact, there are reasons why people have noms de guerre. I only knew Terry for maybe less than a year. And that was a period where I was scoring a lot of really good interviews. So I interviewed him twice. I had loaned Terry some shaver material because he was interested in that. And while I was writing, coincidentally or synchronistically, and I was out of town, the Secret Cipher and Secret Rituals, and put those interviews at the back of each one as an afterthought, basically to pad the book from my point of view. He left town with my shaver material, and I have never seen nor heard from him since. However, in that interview, after the interview, which was like 4 hours, there's a clock behind me, which I didn't know until I saw the tape of it. You can see the hours going by, blinking through, and they reduced the 4 hours to, I guess it's 20 minutes, something like that. I don't know. I haven't timed it or anything, and I've not watched that any more than I've watched any other episode. But afterwards, they pretty well said, well, I don't think he's Terry. And they're right. I'm not, nor was Terry Terry. Nobody took that name to be serious. But there's this, the most controversial point, which is, I used to be involved in very, very radical politics. And after a certain point, when some of our Canadian comrades were imprisoned for having explosive materials, which consisted of fertilizer and ammonia, which probably any household in America has, we decided to take on noms de guerre. Well, Terry arrived when he already had one, and he, obviously the name Terry R Wriste is a nom de guerre. Nobody questioned that, and I only knew him through the political group that I was involved with, my own affinity group. And everybody in the affinity group knew him as well. He was the only one in that group because political people, just like UFO people don't like occult people, and occult people don't like UFO people, or political people don't like any of that stuff. So Terry was an exception, and being a fellow exception, we talked a lot about it. And I said, hey, how about if I put some of this on the record? He said, sure, as long as you use my nom de guerre. And I said, fine. I never did know his real name, and it was impolite to ask in that group. And I've asked a couple of people, not really thinking they're going to, talk about that period of time too much. Are you okay with mentioning what your impressions of Terry were? And they said, no, we stay out of that. We're not involved. And I didn't expect that they would be. But the Hellier season 2, they find another guy that had met Terry in North Georgia somewhere a couple of years later. So, and he wasn't me. By that time, he was in a right-wing militia group, which is, struck me because we were a far left-wing non-militia.
And one of my books is Czech Republic, the most haunted country in the world, and that sells pretty well, especially around Christmas time.
Oh, I've read it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know. I didn't get the name.
Yeah, it's me. I wonder. You. I don't know if you can mention it, but you said in an email you'd been to Prague to do some serious ritual work. What was all that about?
Well, let's see. How long ago was it? Roughly 10 years ago. I don't think it was quite that long. I got a letter from a couple of guys in Prague. They had spent their childhood during the late years of the Warsaw Pact. I heard from these guys, and they said, look, we have a group of people from all over Europe who are interested in being initiated into various of the areas that you have credentials in. If you are willing to come here for, I forget what it was, 10 days, something like that, we will pay your expenses, your travel expenses, your hotel expenses, your food, everything, if you can turn these relative novices into initiates. And I said, well, if you give me lots of strong coffee and pastries throughout, I'll work day and night and I'll give it a try. And people came in from England. They flew in and flew out the same day, and people came in from the Balkan states. We'll just leave it at that. And people from all over the Czech Republic came, and maybe others as well, because there were some linguistic problems. I had to have translators. I do not speak Czech. I was only there for 10 days, but I did a whirlwind of magical initiations. I had a lot of experience with quick initiation because during the Great Arabia Mountain working, which was here, we had people come in from, well, a lot of local people until we sort of saturated the local people because all comers received a gift at no cost. That was my approach, and that's why it's called free illuminism, because it is free and hopefully illuminating. We gave them the egregore, if not the knowledge, and said, go forth and study, which is an ancient rabbinical dictum. That's pretty much what I did. So if I've demystified what I was doing there, it was drinking a lot of coffee, eating a lot of pastries, doing a little sightseeing with my handlers, and also really, really digging the atmosphere in the city. I mean, they took me out to a Celtic, what are they called, menhirs? Those upright stones. That has to be the furthest east that I've ever seen one. And apparently it was part of a set of 8. The communists knocked down some of them, but one was still standing. That was pretty weird. We went to a lot of really, really interesting locations because they wanted me to do my thing, but they also wanted to show off. I think that the odd legacy of the communist era, and I expect at some point this will be true in China as well, is that all sorts of weird forms of spiritual expression, weird is not a bad term to me, are present in Russia and the Ukraine, and go down the list. And
unfortunately, a lot of it is also wrapped up with some very ugly nationalism and right-wing thinking.
Some of it is, some of it isn't, yeah. And I think the ones that, if you study the German youth movement of the 1920s, it easily slid into the Hitler Youth. So it was considered a left-wing, new agey movement. And in fact, that's where the term neo-pagan was first coined to account for those beliefs. But it's easy to get your feet marching. And once the torches are lit and you're marching, it's very easy for it to slip into fascism. I think that's the problem with a lot of occult bodies. So I watch that, and I have a vested interest in seeing that not do too well.
So just to finish off, I was listening into a podcast you did recently where they mentioned that they'd done one with me and had also listened, and it's back to the Hellier thing. It's where, as they moved in the direction of Pan and all this kind of stuff towards the end of that show, it triggered a whole bunch of synchronicities between me and a bunch of other people, because
Me too.
The work I'm doing in the Czech Republic is around Perun and Veles is the horned god, and this idea that we were all taking part in this ritual that was Hellier really struck me very strongly. It actually triggered off some, I don't know if you know Mark Stavish, but it also triggered off some ideas about how not only when you watch Hellier might we all be partaking in some ritual which has individual meaning and perhaps a broader meaning, but any sort of activity that involves an egregore is also the similar sort of thing. So even marketing by a company or a movement can be seen as a ritual in which we're all partaking. I'd like just to comment on that because I thought it was interesting stuff.
Yeah, I'm totally with that. And if I wasn't with that because it was Hellier was beneficial to me, and I'm talking about it in the past tense, I think there will be a Hellier 3, but I do think that what's happened in America is COVID, and it does put a crimp in their style. That is for sure. I don't think the episode where they do a sort of neo-pagan ritual is the ritual itself. What I had told them was your whole experience, if you follow the synchronicities, is a ritual, and you can document that by following the synchronicities. If there are a lot of synchronicities, then you're on the path. If there aren't, there aren't. And they laughed at the balloon thing, and, well, we know what happened there.
Yeah.
And it's still happening to other people. And because I am now famous, I get a lot of feedback now where I got stony silence for years, except from the occultist who said, shut up about that stuff. It's not respectable. Only one occultist was really doing that. But and his drugis, In any case, the people that I know well and that I knew before Hellier are telling me, oh, well, I saw Hellier, and I've been having the strangest synchronicities. Even one of the, not to suggest this to you, because I don't think it's the power of suggestion, one of the hosts of a mainstream radio program in Canada, and I'll just leave it at that, after I did a program with him, I don't really ever hear from these people on a personal basis that do programs, except people that I knew to begin with before podcasting even, was a thing. Yep. This was regular radio. And the guy calls me and he's having these same type of weird experiences. It's like even talking about it is part of the ritual. Mm-hmm. And when, predictably enough, Pan did not appear, in that particular episode, but they got cold. I said, what have you been asking for? You keep asking for Indrid cold. And all of this stuff, if you do ritual magic, you'll find it's very literal, plottingly literal. Oh, that was a Freudian slip. And, Freud. And I think this is going on for a lot of people, because for every person that I have heard from about this, I imagine there are dozens or more who saw Hellier and have what John Keel called the silent contactees. They're having the experiences too, but they're not publicity hounds, so we don't hear them. So it's out there, and I think that so far as Hellier is concerned, when I said to them after the formal interview where they were still running cameras, I said, you're not taking this balloon thing as seriously as you should. And they were polite about it, but they were kind enough to show 3 or 4 hours later, when they were in Kentucky on their way to Ashland or one of those places, they were not bad-mouthing me. I mean, I get along with them very well. But they were saying, why was Greenfield on that balloon thing so much? And he was serious and balloons and there's literally a tree. You can't make this stuff up, right?
No, the tree across the road and the balloon.
And there's a blue balloon under. And I think maybe they still don't know that my other publisher, there's Paranoia Press and there's Blue Star Press. And what was the shape of the balloon? It was Blue Star.
Incredible.
Yeah, it was. It is incredible. And they conceded, well, Greenfield seems to have known what he was talking about. Yeah. Proof of the pudding is in the eating.
And there we go. Thank you to Alan Greenfield for joining me on this edition of The Magical World of G. Michael Vasey. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do read the notes below the podcast to find out where you can buy Alan's book, The Complete Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts, and more information about Alan himself, as well as more information about this podcast. Please do share, like, and post to social media. Help me get this podcast out to more people. Thank you very much. Looking forward to speaking to you again in the near future, when we'll be talking to Tim Walter about dowsing and earth energies. Thank you. Goodbye.